What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to offer my spoiler-free review for the Many Saints of Newark, a Sopranos story, which opens on Friday, October 1st. Last night I got to see it at the world premiere up at the Beacon Theater. The first time I'd been inside that theater since seeing Jerry Seinfeld do stand-up there in the pre-COVID era. It's not necessarily the best theater for showing a movie in that it's a theater for live shows. The screen and everything there were temporarily set up, so the sound was a little fucked up, the dialogue's a little too quiet, and the music was just overwhelming. However, I wasn't about to pass up the opportunity to see this movie. I was a colossal fan of The Sopranos back in the day, and I think it deserves more credit than any other show for ushering in the 21st century premium TV experience, what we expect from a great show, how we consume it. But it's been 14 years since the final season, so I was a little worried that series creator David Chase would not be able to completely recapture the Sopranos experience with just a 2-hour movie. I went into the movie with modest but hopeful expectations, and that is what I advise for every fan of the show. There's some great performances, some great scenes, but this movie is not going to replace anyone's personal favorite season of the show as their new favorite, no matter how much fun it might be to step back into this world. Think of it more like a cool novella or a fantastic supplement to the show, which gives us this great standalone story about Dickie Moltisanti, a character that every diehard fan has always wanted to know more about. He's Christopher's father and one of Tony's key role models, and this movie does a great job of fleshing out this figure who's always been a bit of a mystery. The Many Saints of Newark has a fantastic supporting cast, many of whom knock their performances right out of the park. However, others feel like thin caricatures of classic characters in younger days. Nonetheless, I was glued to my seat every step of the way, and I'll admit that the last scene gave me some massive chills, and I was not alone. The crowd erupted in a thunderous roar, and speaking of the crowd, they were an interesting mix. There were clearly tons of fellas who'd come over from Jersey, dusting off their old t-shirts, and speaking of which, I couldn't resist rocking out my Bada Bing shirt for this review, but the crowd was very ready to get rowdy. Catcalling like hell, especially during the introduction when David Chase brought out the cast. When James Gandolfini's son, Michael, came out, the crowd just poured out their love and affection for his father, and that alone made the whole evening very much worth the price of admission. And while nobody could ever possibly hope to fill Gandolfini's shoes, I was happily surprised by Michael's performance. He did a pretty damn good job acting alongside a lot of seasoned, experienced performers, and if David Chase were to write another movie for Michael Gandolfini in a few years, where we'd get to see the young Tony deeper into his career in his 20s, I'd be all over it. And speaking of which, David Chase has stated publicly that he would like to do a sequel to Many Saints of Newark if he can get back Sopranos writer Terrence Winter. And Terrence Winter apparently replied he would do it in a heartbeat. But let's get into this movie in broad strokes. And once again, I won't be giving anything away, and there are definitely a few key plot points people should try and avoid reading about ahead of the film's release. There's one revelation toward the end of the movie where the whole crowd was just like, "Oh my God!" And that was just, it was a lot of fun to be there to hear that response. But the movie was directed by Alan Taylor, a man who has directed many brilliant episodes of TV for The Sopranos and Game of Thrones. On the other hand, he's also directed some lousy movies like Terminator Genesis and Thor the Dark World. At this stage, I think it's safe to say Alan Taylor will never be the next Martin Scorsese or Brian De Palma, but he's totally fine as long as he has a really strong script to work with. On the whole, I thought the screenplay for this movie was very solid, easily a base hit, perhaps even a double, but I don't think anyone's going to describe it as a home run. The plot itself takes place in two eras, both the late 60s as well as the 70s, when racial tensions in Newark are boiling over. Dickie Moltisanti, played by Alessandro Nivola, he's absolutely the star, but Tony frequently shares the spotlight with him as the young boy and eventually the young man who hero worships Dickie, particularly after Tony's father goes away to jail for a stretch. And speaking of Tony's dad, John Bernthal, he is absolutely fucking hysterical as Johnny Boy, so much so it kind of made me wonder what he could have done with the part if he had played Dickie instead. And speaking of comedy, stand-up legend Joey Diaz, he absolutely kills it in a few key scenes, which should come as no surprise to anyone who has ever seen him perform live. But in terms of the real meat of the story, it's all about Dickie trying to juggle his various responsibilities, providing for his family, doing what needs to be done, but also kind of sort of trying to atone for some of his actions, but trying to do some good deeds on the side. It's a very interesting tightrope that he's trying to walk along. But another dynamite performance comes courtesy of the great Ray Liotta, who leans all the way back into the world of gangsters in ways that we haven't really seen since he was in Goodfellas 30 years ago. His scenes in jail offering advice to Dickie are easily some of the strongest in the movie. And more importantly, the movie never lets us forget that these are two murderers talking to each other, no matter how charismatic they might be or how many good deeds they try and do on the side. And I watched this interview once with David Chase years ago when he was talking about having the same philosophy with the character of Tony Soprano. He never wanted Tony to be this lovable goofball that everybody's excited to see. Every once in a while, the writers would have him do something to remind us all, oh yeah, he's a fucking psycho and he's dangerous, even if he might be the most interesting character in the show, one that we can't take our eyes off of. As far as the rest of the cast goes, I loved Corey Stoll as Uncle Junior. He didn't have a ton of screen time, but what he got, he absolutely delivered. Leslie Odom Jr., who I'd never seen before, he was an interesting ally/adversary for Dickie. And then Vera Farmiga, she absolutely nailed it as Tony's mom, Livia. Unfortunately, there's some other cast members who feel like they're simply doing kind of lousy imitations of famous characters, but folks can decide for themselves which cameos they think work the best. But each and every time a classic character would show up, even if it was just for a few seconds, the crowd just went absolutely crazy, especially if these characters were referencing a particular detail that would pay dividends decades later in the lives of these characters. As far as some of my criticisms go, my only legitimate grievance is towards some of the mouth-breathing knuckleheads seated beside me. This giant dude stumbled in, stinking of booze, and sat down right beside me just as the screen was going dark, and he proceeded to spend the entire movie nervously checking his phone and his watch every few seconds. Even during this kick-ass explosive shootout, as well as during a really gnarly torture sequence, he just kept doing it. I'm sorry, if you can't go more than a few seconds without checking your devices, see a doctor. Something's wrong with you. Or go play in traffic. I really don't care. Just stay out of the movie theater. But my only real criticism of the movie itself is that it falls shy of greatness. Hardly a stoning offense. But it has to be said because I worry that a lot of people are going to go into this movie with wildly unrealistic expectations, thinking that this 2-hour story is somehow going to be able to match or replicate their sentimental affection for all 86 episodes of their favorite show. It's just not possible. For years, we lived in the home of the Sopranos. We watched their kids grow up. We knew what we would see each time they opened the refrigerator door. That experience cannot be replaced with a quick prequel movie. But with all that said, watching this movie is going to make a lot of you want to watch the classic show all over again. That's all I could think about on the subway ride home. But that's all I can say at this point without starting to give some things away, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this review. I hope everyone enjoys the movie as much as I did when it comes out next week. And if you enjoyed this review, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and if you want some long-form content, hunt down my podcast, Wrong Reel, which is linked in the notes below. But I can't thank you enough for watching the video, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.